All right, friends, thanks for coming back to the channel. And as promised, we're going to talk about a different way to seed the database. And in my opinion, a better way to seed the database, just because it encapsulates the seeding process a little bit and separates it from the DB context. So if you were following along with me in the last video, what we had here was the DB context class, or in this case, home furnishings context.cs, and we seeded it right in here by using the override void on model creating method and then putting in all of our data in here, which is cool. That totally worked. But this time what I want to do is something a little bit different. So if you've got a notepad, go ahead and open up that notepad, and we're going to take all these on model creating that we just made, and we're going to copy them and put them right in there. Okay, and then just minimize that. We'll come back to it later. That way we don't lose our data. And then I'm just going to take this whole method here, the protected override on model creating, and delete it. So go ahead and do that. And then save that. And then back in the developer PowerShell, make sure you're in the API, of course. I am, so that's cool. And then I'm going to say .NET EF database drop. And I'm just going to go ahead and drop that database. And that's going to be a yes for me. Yep. And cool. That's done. All taken care of. And then I'm also going to go over here to my migrations, and I'm going to delete that as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete the whole migrations folder. No big deal. We do this all the time. Okay. All right. So now that that's done, I don't necessarily need this class open, and I'm going to close these databases because I shouldn't have them anymore, if I'm not mistaken. If I just refresh real quick, go to databases, yep, the home furnishings database is no longer there, which is good. All right, so now what I want to do is I want to come back over to Solution Explorer, and in my data folder, I'm going to add a new class. I'm going to say new class, and I'm going to call this class seed. There we go. All right, now in this seed class, what I want to do is basically create a method that's going to seed the data. The thing is, though, in order for this to work, it has to be a static class. That means it is basically just there, that can be called later on, and it's not going to be changed or moved or anything like that. It's static. That's the best way I can think of it. So I'm going to say public static async, because I want to do an async task, and I'm just going to call it seed data. And then I'm going to inject the, what do we call it? Call it the home furnishings context, and we'll just call it context. Okay. And curly braces down. There we go. Okay. So now what I want to do is I want to only run this, because this method is going to run if my database doesn't have anything in it. So what I'm going to say is if, and I'm going to say context, and that's going to refer to the database. And we're going to say context dot rooms, so that's the table in the database. And I'm going to say dot any. And what that means is that, hey, does it have anything in there? And I'm also going to say or context dot, oops, not convention, that's silly. Context dot furnishings, furnitures, sorry. I don't know what that is. Furnishings. Furnitures. There we go. Dot any. There we go. And that should work. And then I'm going to say if all that stuff, then return. And I'll show you where we're going to return to later on anyways. And now we're going to go ahead and put our seed data in this class instead. So I'm going to start with saying var rooms. Sorry. Var rooms. And we'll say new list. And then this will be a list of rooms. Yep, it should be. Because that's what we got, right? Hold on. Yeah, a list of, room. List of room. Okay, and then I want to, make sure that's in there. Cool. And let's do that. And let's do, hold on one second. Get out of the way. Get out of the way. Our rooms new. Sorry. Equals. Almost forgot that equals. That's kind of important. And now I'm going to just take all the data from here and I'm going to copy it in there. So it's going to be room. And then I'm going to say, let's see what we got going on here. I'm going to say new room. I'm going to copy that section right there. And there we go. And then I want another room after. So first of all, make sure what you got going on here is new room. And then we've got our ID. And I'm actually going to get rid of that right now. I'm just going to comment it out. I'm going to say the name, the description, there we go. And I'm going to add another one after it because this is a list. So I'm going to put a comma to show that I'm going to be adding another one. And I'm going to do the exact same thing. So again, if you missed what I was highlighting here, I started with the new and I highlighted all the way down to the other curly brace here, or curly bracket. And I'm just going to add that in there. There we go. I'm going to comment out that ID and I'll explain why in just a second, unless of course this doesn't work, in which case I'm just going to explain to you why I am a doofus. But anyways, you probably already knew that. You've been coming to the channel long enough. You get it. You understand programming. When these guys are making their programming tutorial videos, they make it seem like they're doing all this stuff on the fly. No, they practice. I did not practice, which I probably should have in retrospect, but whatever. Okay, and so now I've got my rooms going on here, and oh, almost forgot, comment that ID out as well. Now, this is just for the rooms, but I want to get in also the, I want to get in the furnitures too. So with the furnitures, I'm going to say var furnitures equals, and we're going to say new list furniture. There we go, just like we did with the rooms. And down here, where's my furnitures? There we go. I'm going to say new furniture. Okay, I'm going to copy that, and that's going to go right there. Okay, I'm going to get rid of that ID. We're going to come back to this in just a second. I'm going to say comma there. And then I also want, where we go? There we go. And I also want this furniture. So new furniture down to that curly brace and add one more. There we go. And comment out that ID. And then I'm going to put a semicolon right there. Okay, now here is where things get tricky, because when we're seating like this, what it's actually going to do is it's going to insert all those things into the database, but the entity framework, what it typically does is it will put IDs in here based off of like its own whimsy, I guess. So you are specifying that, for instance, the room needs an ID. If you don't give it an ID, then it's going to insert the ID how it wants to, or how it's going to make its own ID for it, which is fine because honestly, let Entity Framework do the legwork for us. But we've got to work with it just a little bit to make sure that it is doing what we want. What I mean is that this couch, we want it to go into the living room, right? But when this living room entity gets inserted in the database, Entity Framework is going to give it its own ID. And I'll show you what that looks like in a second. We don't know what that ID is going to be. It could be 1, it could start at 0, it could be like 11,000. We don't know. So what we're going to do first is we're going to insert those rooms into the database. So we're going to say await context dot, and we're going to say rooms. No, not raw context. Come on, Visual Studio, work with me. Dot add range async, and then we're going to say rooms. There we go. And then we're going to say await context dot save changes async. There we go. All right. So now what this does here is it saves the rooms into the database. Now the rooms are in the database. So now what I want to do is I want to get, for these two things, I want to, and this can be a little tedious, but I want to get the IDs now that those rooms got. So I'm going to say, I'm going to access the database. I'm going to say var living room, because that's the first one I want, equals context dot rooms dot single, and we're going to say r goes to r dot name equals, and I'm going to look for living room. There we go. And then I'm also going to do the same thing here with var, and that's going to be dining room equals, and that's going to be context dot rooms dot single, and then r goes to r dot, what did I say? R dot, I can never remember it. There we go. R dot name equals dining room. And of course, since these are strings, you want to make sure that you get them absolutely correct. So dining room, there we go. And living room. Perfect. All right, so now I have, what I've done now is I've accessed the database in this context class, and I have gotten out of there the entity that is the living room, and the entity that is the dining room. And now I will have access to those particular IDs. So here for room ID, I want this to be the living room. So I'm going to say living room dot ID. And over here for the room ID for the dining table, I'm going to say dining room dot ID. And so what that's going to do is it's going to link the ID for the living room to this piece of furniture and the ID for the dining room to this piece of furniture without us having to do anything extra as far as like going in and doing it ourselves. Now it does require some calls to the database, which I'm not a huge fan of, but I imagine there's probably an easier way to do it like this, like maybe retrieve all this as a string or something like that, or sorry, as a list of all the rooms and then access each one of them here at a time instead of making 2 database calls. But it's all good for all our intents and purposes, not really that big of a deal. And then once we have done that, we're going to do the same thing that we did up there. We're going to say await context dot furnitures dot add range async, and we're going to say furnitures, and then we're going to say await context dot save changes async. All right. So now that the C class is done, now all we have to do is call it. And we want to call this when our program class runs. And we need to do some injection stuff in order to make that happen. So find your program.cs in your API, of course. So I'm going to say program.cs. There we go. And then I like to do this underneath the map controllers. It's not necessarily required, but I'm just going to call this seeding the database. There we go. Okay. All right. So what we need to do is we need to call this seed class. I'm going to move it over here so we can see it a little bit better. But what's important to notice is that when we call it the seed data method, and it's static, so we can call it without having to create an instance of it. In order to call it, we also need to pass it a context. Well, we don't have a context here yet, so we need to get a context. So we're going to start with a using, and we're going to say var scope equals app dot services dot create scope. So we're going to create a scope, a scoped object here. And then in those services, var services, in that scope, we're going to say var services equals scope dot service provider. Okay, so essentially what we're doing is we're creating a instance of the iService provider interface that's going to allow us access to our context class before we actually run the app. So it's going to basically give us access to it without having to, because right down here, obviously it's app.run. That's when the whole app is running. We want to be able to access it and run it even though it's not running, which is kind of a weird thing to think about. But anyway, so we're going to say var context in here. We're going to try this. Say var context equals, and we're going to say services dot get required service. And then it's going to be a service of, what we call this, home furnishings context. There we go. And close off with parentheses. Then we're going to say await context dot database dot migrate async. And that is going to call the, not migrate. That would not work. This is going to call all of our migrations. So it's going to migrate our database right then and there. And then we're going to say await seed dot seed data. There we go. And then we're going to pass it the context class that we just created. And we're going to try and do that. And if for whatever reason it doesn't work, we're going to just make sure we have the exception thrown here. And we want to display that out. So we're going to say var logger equals services, because this is another part of the service. We're going to say get required service. And and this is going to be an instance of the iLogger service, and it's going to be in the program class. There we go. Close that off. And then finally, we're going to say logger.log error, and that's going to be the exception that we throw. And then we're going to send a message as well. So we're going to say an error occurred during migration/seeding. That way we know something happened there. And I spelled occurred wrong. It has 2 C's. Okay, so now we can save that. Okay, should be good. And what's beautiful about this is, let's see, we can just go ahead and create our migration. So we'll say .NET EF migrations add, and then we'll make another initial, create, and it's going to be in the output directory of data/migrations. All right, let's go ahead and do that real quick. Make ourselves a, oops, I spelled create wrong, but that's okay, not a big deal. All right, we should have that there, migrations, cool, looking good. And then let's go ahead and try this here. We're gonna say, let's see, I'm gonna clear this so it's not all wonky. .NET EF database update, okay? And we're just gonna go ahead and update our database so that we actually have a database to insert things into. And then we'll say .NET run. And that will run the app. And we should see a whole bunch of infos here with no fails. Oh, that's good. And then if we go to our SQL Server Object Explorer and explore, we should hopefully have not only a database, but it should also be a bunch of tables in there that have all of our things in there that we wanted to have. So let's go ahead and do that. Hey, there we go. And look at that. It did give it ID of 1, 2, and 3. That's kind of cool. And then furniture, same thing. We're going to say view data. And once again, we'll just go ahead and shrink that, open it up. Hey, there we go. And it gave us our room ID and our correct our IDs here. So, okay, that was cool, and that worked out just great. And I like this a little bit better because, as you'll notice, like I said, we commented out the ID. So Entity Framework puts the IDs in there for us without us having to worry about it. And that's kind of the standard procedures, not procedures. That's typically how Entity Framework works. It handles all the ID creation for us without us having to think about it. And that actually just makes things a lot better. So when we're running our controllers later on in our API, and we're inserting things and doing all of our CRUD operations, we don't got to worry about providing it with IDs. The IDs will be made for us when we insert things or whatever. So that takes that part of the process out of our control, which is good. That's a good thing. Okay, so there you go. And that is now our database has been seeded. We have a program that actually has some data in it. And now in the next lesson, what we can actually start talking about is building some controllers so we can see this data on the outsides. Because right now as it is, there's not really a whole lot going on. If we run the backend Swagger type stuff, which we haven't really gone over, but I think it's there. Let me see, actually. I don't even know what, let's see. If you want to see like what everything is doing, you actually can. Let me see if I can do that real quick for you. If you go to appsettings.json, no, not appsettings.json, JK. If you go to, is it properties? Oh, launch settings, there we go. If you go to launch settings.json, you've got these HTTP local hosts things right here, and those local hosts will take you to where you can access your backend. So I'm actually going to copy this one here. And the reason I'm copying this one, because one, it says HTTP and it also says Swagger right here. And that's what I want to actually access is Swagger. So I'm going to do that. And I'm going to open up a new browser window right here. And I'm going to type that in and go to it and see what I got. And nothing, of course. But I think what I actually need to do is, hold on a second. If I go / weather forecast, there we go. All right, so I got weather forecast because I have a weather forecast controller right here, and you should have the same thing if you didn't delete it. And that weather forecast controller is the default controller that comes with this when you build it. So you can actually access that and see what it's doing. And every time you refresh, you should get different numbers here. You'll notice here it's temperatures 5 and 40. If I refresh now, it's 44 and 111. So that's kind of cool. And then I think actually if you do this and say Swagger, there you go. So if you type in that localhost address and type Swagger at the end and hit enter, it's going to take you to our API backend. And Swagger is just kind of a nice way that Microsoft gives us like a little UI to access all of our controllers. And we'll utilize this a little bit more later on when we are building our controllers, because it's built in, it's really easy to use. So it's kind of cool. And so like for the weather controller, for the weather forecast, you can actually try it out. Hey, that's what the button says, LOL. And for this, because it's just a get, all I'm doing is executing. So if I execute this, what it's going to be doing is essentially asking for some data. And that's what it does. It gives me back this row of datas. There we go. I've got 5 weather forecast things. And if I execute it again, I should get different datas. Yep, and you'll get the same thing. So when you, or if you want to, go ahead and give that a shot. Check out your Swagger and see how it is. We can't access anything on the back end with our rooms or furnitures yet because we haven't built any controllers, but that will be in the next video. So hopefully you enjoyed this, and I will see you in the next video.